Hi, this is Kate, one of the hosts of Everything Cookbooks. Today's episode is one of a 6-part series during which we are re-releasing some of our favorite conversations that go into the topic of voice. In this episode, Molly and I get into finding your voice with Tori Ritchie, a longtime cookbook editor, author, and teacher based in San Francisco. Tori used to teach this fantastic class through the Stanford Extension program on cookbook writing, and some of her students include Michelle Tam of Nom Nom Paleo, Nicole Acetola, author of Scandinavian from Scratch. We've had Nicole on, and Anna Voloshina, author of Budmo, and we've also had Anna on. In this episode, we go into tips for developing and writing a voice, as well as bad habits, aka happy robot voice. Enjoy this episode, and we'll be back in the fall with a whole new lineup of host chats and guest interviews. Thank you for listening. We've all heard it. Happy robot voice, the cheerleading head note that assures you that fermenting stinging nettles to serve over roast duck is something totally doable for a weeknight dinner. So how do we make sure we're not writing about food like a robot? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and I'm here with Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Kate, how are you?
I'm doing well. So before we get into our interview today, I wanted to ask just what is happy robot voice to you?
I know exactly what you're talking about, not only from reading it, but from writing it. It's that cloying, gratuitous, silly, it's that voice. I actually just saw this head note, and I'm not going to say where it was. A deliciously unique sensation will greet you when you make this recipe.
I think that would be great in a cozy mystery novel, because that would be something that maybe somebody is going to kill someone with arsenic in the cake. And, that's how they're going to get the person to eat the cake. But that doesn't belong. Yeah. That's not going to make me want to make a recipe.
Or it's like this zippy, bright salsa is a summer sensation.
Serve it with, chips and please all your family and friends.
It's the best you've ever made. Yeah. It's a trap I think we all fall into.
Exactly. I've done it. You've done it. We're not pointing the finger here. We're just trying to make sure that we don't use it so the robots won't come for our jobs.
Exactly.
Right? So on that note, that's why on the show today, we're bringing on Tori Ritchie to talk about finding your voice in food writing. She has 35 years of experience in cookbooks, both, I think this is interesting, as an editor, as a developing editor, and as a writer. She was also food editor at San Francisco Magazine and started the recipe website TuesdayRecipe.com in 2007. And we're going to ask her all about that. But what might be also interesting to everyone listening is she teaches an annual course at Stanford Continuing Studies called, and this is easy to remember, How to Write a Cookbook. And when she's not in the cookbook writing world, she also gives food and history tours at San Francisco's Ferry Building, which is a delicious place to visit if you find yourself in San Francisco. With no further ado, let's get to the interview. Tori, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you. I am excited to be here, you guys, because I do listen to you. I listen to every episode, but I usually listen to you in the bathtub.
You're the first person I've heard the bathtub, because I could see if you didn't like the podcast and you're listening to the bathtub, it would be really annoying because you have to get up, you're soaking wet. Turn to a new podcast.
Fast forward.
I guarantee it. That's the time I set aside, the 45 minutes or whatever it is to an hour. And I'm not in the bathtub today, is all I'll say, but that's where I listen to you and I love it. And I just love the contribution that you're making to this conversation, because it's one I've been having for 35 years. And I am really excited about it. And I'm honored to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. And one of the things we're so excited about is reaching out and getting other voices into this conversation, because just like you said, these are conversations that those of us in the field behind the scenes have been having, but to be able to have them in sort of a more public forum it's been really great. So thanks for being here.
And on that note, Tori, just take us back. So you said that you've been working in cookbooks for 35 years. Can you take us back to your first job?
So my first job, so I went to cooking school. I went to college, and then I worked for 2 years in New York. And when I came back to my hometown, which is San Francisco, I went to a culinary program. And then I actually assisted a cookbook author at first to kind of learn my way through, which I think is really good advice for wannabe cookbook authors. Not that many people do it nowadays. They kind of have so many ways to launch in, but it is really good to work with someone in their test kitchen, which is what I did, which was his home kitchen in Berkeley. Then I got a full-time job at Sunset Books. So there was Sunset Magazine, which people on the West Coast all know, and for people elsewhere, it was a Western living publication, for the entire 20th century,
iconic,
basically.
Really.
Yeah.
Totally iconic.
I love those old issues that you sometimes find that you're just like, wow, that's still such a great idea. It holds up.
Yeah.
There's some stuff that's just classic.
It had a famous food editor there when I was there. Her name was Jerry DeVecchio, and she was a legend, and she was great, and she was formidable, but really a great teacher. However, I worked in the book division because in those days, there were things called branded cookbooks. And those were series that were put out by publishers that basically repackaged their information from either a magazine or other books. So some of the famous ones, there was an amazing Time Life Foods of the World series that was put out by Time Life. There were the Sunset Books. Southern Living has always had a book division. This was, for me, a perfect job. I wanted to be a cookbook author. I went to culinary school. I did an externship at Chez Panisse Cafe. I did not want to work in restaurants. And I was fortunate enough to just be in the right place at the right time. And I got it the old-fashioned way. A friend of mine worked there in the marketing division and saw a flyer on a bulletin board looking for a food editor. So I got the job, and what I did was it was wonderful because I both edited and wrote cookbooks. So they would assign me a title, and that's fundamental to branded publishing. They know what's going to sell. They tell you, okay, we're going to do a barbecue cookbook. I never did one, but the first one I worked on was Fish and Shellfish A to Z.
Wow, that's a tough subject. It's a massive subject, but also just fish availability, how to test all the recipes. Are these going to be recipes home cooks are actually going to make? Fish is just still a hard subject for cookbook authors.
Especially if you don't like fish. I don't love fish.
Do you not like fish?
I do, but not all fish. I love shellfish.
I'm sure you didn't say that then when you were assigned the book.
I was 27.
So you say, yes, I can do that.
Oh,
I can do that. Yeah. What else do you need?
And I actually had to commute from San Francisco to Menlo Park, where Sunset Books is. And I would stop actually near the airport, and I would go to a seafood market every morning and pick up freshly flown in seafood or local, but mainly it was freshly flown in those days, because we would do, sure, we got local sole and halibut and salmon in season, but we also did everything. Anyway, I won't go into that whole thing because wow. It's a long story. But so I would work with in that case, there was an editor from the magazine I worked with. But for the most part, I would be assigned a topic. I would go through the magazines. I would choose about 2/3 of the recipe from years and years of the magazine. Then I would develop the other third.
Oh.
I would also write all of the wraparound copy. So that's everything from the book intro to they had chapter intros, they had tip boxes, they had notes, they had, of course, head notes. So there was a lot of material that went with the books because the books were very how-to and very accessible. And also, I will tell you, very successful.
Yeah. So
it was, an income stream. That's why these publishers who were basically magazine publishers, Better Homes and Gardens, they were all over the country. And it was big business in those days. And I was an employee. I had a salary, which I needed. I couldn't, I really could not have made a living as a cookbook author in those days. And so I was a writer and an editor, which was fantastic training.
That's an incredible experience.
Did you ever have your name on any of the books? Were you buried in sort of the fine print in the back of the book? Or was it just anonymous because you were a salaried employee, you're doing the work, but it's really underneath the brand and maybe the editor-in-chief of the time?
Okay, you know exactly how you nailed it right there. It was not buried. It was on the masthead, which is is the page that is all of the material, but never on the cover. All branded books were, it said sunset, 5 ingredients or less, or 6, I can't remember, but that was one book I worked on. Cooking for 2. Then on the masthead page, it would indeed list all of the editors in the actual test kitchen for the magazine, because the majority of the recipes were generated by them. And then I would get a credit as writer.
Oh, okay.
This is so interesting in the context of voice, which is what we're, especially going to talk about today, and talk to you because you teach about voice. But those projects, those books, it was very much a branded voice. 2/3 of the content came from other contributors. Then you're writing a whole, not only another third of the recipes, but all the wraparound text. But yet in the end, the voice is this sunset voice. So it all hangs together as a branded book.
They had a very specific house style, which again is something there still house styles at Bon Appetit and the New York Times for sure, and Food and Wine, and everybody has them. They're essentially, in those days, it was a huge thick binder of how you express everything consistently. So the majority was about the ingredients and methods. So controversially, they always put the equipment first in a frying pan, warm the oil and onions over medium-high heat, which I know is we could have a whole show on that topic,
yes, we
right? But, and also, every time you expressed, if an ingredient was boneless, skinless chicken breast, as we would call them nowadays, in those days, they would say 1 whole chicken breast split, skinned and boned. And you'd have to say that every single time. But Molly, more to the point of voice, and we will get into voice in methods. There's not much opportunity for it in the ingredient list, but yes, the voice of the head notes and all of the intros and everything had to be in the house style. And the house style was this disembodied, you can do this, make this ahead. It was never first person, never, because there was no author on the cover. Sunset was the author. The brand was the author. So you couldn't throw in the wonderful personal stories that bring cookbooks to life. But yes, the voice had to be this disembodied, very authoritative, very clear, but almost like happy, peppy, bursting with love robot.
The happy robot voice.
Kate and I talk about that, the happy robot voice. Yeah.
But it's so easy to slip into happy robot voice, no matter if you are writing your own book, because it's just like, you can do this on a Friday night, and it's like that second person, I think, what we were talking about. It's not the first person of, I love this recipe because, it's more like, you can do it. Yay. And it's that cheerleader sort of voice that it's sometimes you try to escape from it and it just kind of finds you sometimes.
Well, I also think as young or new food writers, we sometimes fall into it because we think that's what we're supposed to, because we've read so much of that.
That's right. It gets in your head.
Yeah.
I mean, fortunately, again, times are different, and everybody, even working for branded companies, is encouraged to be personal and use the first person and whatnot. However, this is with my students, because I do teach a class called How to Write a Cookbook. My students, invariably the new ones who haven't really experienced much cookbook writing before, that's the voice they write in. This is the best barbecue sauce you're ever going to have. You're going to want to eat it on everything. And, I always want to write my edit note, because I give in pretty hardcore edits. I'll say, well, I really don't think it would be good on blueberries.
or ice cream, for that matter. I mean, maybe, and somebody's going to come back to us and say, well, actually, I've made this blueberry barbecue vanilla ice cream, and it was, the hit of the town. But exactly, like, nothing is going to be good for everybody or everything.
So I'm curious. So you do this, which sounds like an enormous opportunity to be both writer and editor, especially at that point in your career. So, but how do you go from there? Like, was your next project one where you needed to develop your own voice?
Yeah, well, I was 10 years in branded cookbooks. I went from Sunset to a company called Well Known, and we did all those branded cookbooks for Williams-Sonoma, which were also very successful and also had a complete house-style happy robot voice. I didn't write it. I was the editor-producer of dozens of those cookbooks. And then in the early 2000s, I went off on my own, which was great. And at that point, I had been the food editor of San Francisco Magazine, which gave me the opportunity to work with a lot of writers who were writing in the first person. It was essentially a city magazine that had done a lot of restaurant reviews. And I introduced a whole cooking segment. And we didn't do recipes, but we had people write personal essays about food. That was helpful to me to work with other writers to get them encouraged. So then when I went off and started writing my own cookbooks for Chronicle Books, as well as my newsletter, TuesdayRecipe.com, which I launched in 2007.
Amazing.
Anyway, so I used to send it every Tuesday, and I don't think I've sent it since Tuesday, June 30th or something. I mean, it's whatever, a year ago,
it's whatever Tuesday, whatever Tuesday works out.
It's occasional Tuesday recipe now.
I like it.
So yes, it was very hard for me. Now, I mean, not everyone was in my position where they'd had this drilled into their heads, this happy robot voice. The way that I finally shook it out of my brain is through the newsletter. I have to say, like in my first cookbook for Chronicle, I did one called Party Appetizers. And I had a recipe in there for Moroccan meatballs. And, the head note was like a typical serviceable head note. I think I even have it here. Meatballs are a cocktail party standard, but this Moroccan version, blah, 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 blah. Like it was total. And what I didn't write in that recipe was that I learned this in Marrakesh on a food trip. I actually went there for cooking school. And there was an amazing local woman who taught us recipes, mainly tagines and whatnot. And I said, what do you make at home for your kids? And she said, I always make meatballs. And that's the story I should have told. So it took me a while, even in my own cookbooks, to get rid of that standard sort of head note ease, if we will. The best practice was my newsletter. And the reason was that I felt like I was talking personally to my reader, and I started to be more personal. Now, I do write short, and this was in the era of blogs, and people were writing really long blog posts. And they were very unfiltered and very personal. And we know how many people came out of that to be great cookbook writers as well, and to have great voices. I still like to write just a paragraph or two before my recipes. I don't really need to tell my whole life story with each one. But the practice of my newsletter was really helpful to make me more personal. I don't know, for some reason I could see the reader.
Absolutely. And that meatball story, it's so interesting and such an incredible story because two things stand out for me. One, it's a confidence. And I know for myself as a young writer, I had such little confidence in my own stories, in my own voice. And so I would default to what I thought was proper food writing, as opposed to digging down and figuring out really why this recipe was going to be in my book or my article. And so to me, that's just really a confidence thing. But then that writing your newsletter, that everyday practice of writing, Kate, you told a story recently about writing fiction, how it freed you up, but just that everyday practice of putting words on paper, if you keep at it, you will find your voice. It's in there. You just keep at it. Right. That's really a wonderful story.
And it is. The only way to get to it is practice, because you can't. And I also have a master, an MFA in creative writing, which I did in my 50s, which was just something I always wanted to do. But I will tell you this, that you can't actually teach voice. The person has to find it. We all have it.
You said you cannot teach it.
I don't believe you can teach someone voice. I believe you can teach them the skills to access their voice and to be better writers. And I believe this because I've taught this course for 11 years, and I have seen people, really over the course even of the 8 or 12 weeks that I'm teaching, I have seen them really get there through work. You do have to work, and you do have to make a regular writing practice.
I think that's a huge takeaway, that it's something that you can't give somebody a voice. They have to find their voice, and you can give them the tools to help them find their voice, but it's inside all of us, and you just kind of had to access it. I remember the first time I sat down to try to figure out how to write a cookbook, and I think what I end up doing, and I think a lot of writers do this, is that you start looking at books that you admire and you start trying to sound like those books. Like, this is how the Zuni Cafe cookbook is written. So that means that my book has to sound like I'm Judy Rogers. Well, I'm not, but I feel like when I read, say, some of the head notes for A16, which were heavily edited because I needed a lot. There was a lot of red on that manuscript. I needed a lot of help to try to get my words into better shape. But now when I read it, it doesn't quite sound like how I would write now at all. But I thought it was all part of the learning curve. And I think a newsletter is such a good idea for somebody who just wants to try to find. They have an idea of what they sound like, but then when you see it on the page, sometimes it doesn't quite match up. And by doing that practice, you can kind of get there a little bit. So I love that idea.
And we all know there are tools. I mean, I wish I had had the tools, right?
Right.
So there's Substack now, and there's a ton of people writing about food on Substack. But social media posts, whichever way, whether you started with Twitter and then you went to Facebook and then you're now on Instagram and then now you're on TikTok or whatever. Mm-hmm. I think those unfiltered ways of expressing yourself where it has an instant, like there's sort of a pressure to make it spontaneous can be really, really helpful. On the other hand, a printed book lives in your hands for a long, long time. And Kate, you probably look at your first cookbook, A16, every once in a while and think, wow. But I do. So the voice or the habit of writing on social media or, a longer form like Substack, I do think that's great practice. And I don't think your reader expects it to be perfectly edited. I think readers do expect things to be really perfectly edited in cookbooks, especially the ingredient list and the method, for sure.
Absolutely.
So it's funny, when I teach food writing, the first thing I teach is how to write a recipe. And that's less about voice than it is about the ingredients being in the same
technique.
Order that they come in the method.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to make a case for throwaway writing and writing practice, not for publishing. And I think that's something that I know I struggle with this. I've talked to Andrea about this, that, there's an inefficiency in it. It's like, well, I'm too busy to write something that's no one else is going to see. So I agree that social media and other sort of quick forms are a great way to get practice, but there's also still great value in just writing for yourself, whether it's, in a journal or note taking or that, but that's just old school.
No, I think it's actually a very important technique. And just to, journaling is great for you in every way. And some people keep a journal of the journey of writing a book or a cookbook. That's just for them.
Interesting.
And also, I do want to really encourage this part of it. I mean, we all know that Anne Lamott had a famous phrase in her wonderful book, Bird by Bird, shitty first drafts. Oops, I'm not sure I can swear on this podcast.
Nope, you can say it. It's fine.
And so, that is true. And that can be true of your cookbook writing too. And what I teach my students is, whether it's the head note or you're writing a big essay, of 800 words or whatever or more, what you want to do is write that first draft and set it aside, which you don't do in social media. Set it aside and then at least for an hour, preferably for a day, because when you come back to it, you can do two things. You can edit it for sure. And most of it, I'd say cut a third of it out of it because you probably have too many adjectives. You've said it's delicious and gooey and warm and satiny, when you're talking about your caramel sauce. Well, you only need one adjective.
One of those words. Yes.
And
we're all laughing just because we all know.
We've all done
it. Yeah.
But also come back to it and ask yourself, is this what I really want to say? Because what we say on those unfiltered first drafts is often not completely, but it points you in the direction. Now, Kate, you said you had a lot of red marks on your manuscript for A16. You must have had a good editor.
I was so lucky to have a good editor. Editing now, if you're a debut author, you're not necessarily going to get the amount of handholding I got in 2006 and 2007 when I was working on that book. But that was my school on how to write a cookbook. I knew nothing. I mean, I was learning as I went on, like the order of ingredients and and I was, okay, I have to say, in the pan over medium heat, add the oil. I mean, I was learning this on the fly. I didn't know the rules, so to speak. I couldn't break any rules because I was still learning the rules. And yeah, if I hadn't had not only a good editor, but a really good copy editor, that book wouldn't have been the same.
It's very, very nice to have an editor that really works with you on the language. Yeah.
So you talked about your MFA, which you said you sort of got later. Had you already started your newsletter?
No, I started the newsletter in 2007, and then I went to grad school in 2014. It was just a gift to myself. I'd always wanted to do it, and I loved it. And I'm not saying people have to go get an MFA, but man, oh man, if you love to write, it was really something. And some of my favorite food writers have MFAs. A couple of things I picked up from and it wasn't about food. I mean, I was in the nonfiction creative writing department, so it was a lot of memoir and essays.
I'll stop right there just to say to everybody, when we're talking about good writing, we're talking about good writing. I mean, sometimes I think all three of us here sometimes feel that food writing gets pigeonholed. It's like, oh, that's okay to sound like a happy robot because that's food writing. We're talking like food writing is nonfiction writing. It should just be good writing is good writing. So I feel like what you're saying about to say about your MFA program and the tips you learn can be applied to everyone who listens to this podcast that likes to write, whether you're writing about food or not.
Absolutely, Kate. And everybody should be proud of their, of writing a cookbook. It's really writing. I mean, it's writing a book. Because I do hear people say, oh, I've never written a book. I mean, I've written a cookbook, but I'm like, that's a book. That's a real book. Anyway, one of the key things is that in order to be a good writer, you have to also be a good reader. So that was a big part of my MFA. So I encourage my students, my food writing students, to read a lot of different voices. Yes, my reading assignments are all about food, but yes, read everybody. Read a lot of different voices. Notice what you like. Don't try to copy. You can't be a good writer if you're not a good reader. The other thing that is a mistake I see starting cookbook authors make, and we learned this in MFA about all of our writing, trust your reader. You don't have to be so pedantic, and that's the hard thing because we are teaching in cookbooks. Like they're teaching on the page. But you can trust the reader. The reader can decide if it's the best barbecue sauce in the world, right? So use those words because it is interesting. On a cookbook, the bulk of the words in the manuscript, a 60,000 word manuscript, or in my case, for my MFA, I had to write a 140-page thesis, but that was all prose. In a cookbook, the bulk of it is those recipes, right? But the habit is of people to oversell everything, especially first-time writers. They're excited about their recipes, and they do think their chocolate chip cookie is the best in the world. Use that limited space of a head note to actually be more specific. I know this, Molly, you're a big fan of getting away from generalized and being more specific in language, which is really important. Pete Wells, who is the current restaurant critic at the New York Times, was interviewed, I think, for the New Yorker. And he said that instead of saying everything's delicious and luscious and scrumptious, and just, by the way, get rid of any word that ends in IOUS.
Yeah, scrumptious is one of my least favorite. I have to say, I don't think I've ever eaten something and said, you know what, that was scrumptious.
Yeah. It's one of the biggest challenges for all of us still every day, for me and for you too, I'm sure. We love our food. It's delicious, but we cannot say that 450 times in a book. Right. And so Pete Wells said that what he tries to do is describe the emotional response that the food evokes rather than describing the food, which is a little, esoteric, but it makes perfect sense. And you can do that by telling a little story, as I should have with those Moroccan meatballs. The reader would connect much more than these are the perfect party appetizer with,
Right.
Happy robot voice.
I think the head note we're taught, you're trying to sell the recipe. You're trying to encourage the reader to make the recipe. For me, I always think I'm validating why it's in the book. Why does this recipe deserve space on the page? And so it is tempting to sell too hard. But I think more importantly is what's your personal connection to the recipe, and are there ways you can describe it without saying, this is simply delicious?
No, but I think, first of all, Molly, I think for sure overselling is a problem in head notes, and especially because in the tradition of newspapers and that used to have Wednesday food sections and magazines that came out monthly, they were selling every recipe. But in a collection of recipes in a cookbook, we can actually have a storyline that almost goes throughout the book. And that's what I think that's why people buy cookbooks today, for the stories they tell. There's one out right now that I love, which is Life is What You Bake It by Valerie Lomas. And she tells basically a story throughout of both her family and the relationship of these recipes to who she cooked it with and who she learned it from, as well as the fact that she has an interesting story. She connects those recipes to that thread. So it runs throughout her head notes and in her little tips and all of that, how she learned it, when she learned it, that who she learned it from. And I love that book. I think it tells a really beautiful story. And it's not, she's a very accessible writer, right? This is not something that is esoteric, and she's a very accessible writer.
You don't all have to become lyrical, poetic, gorgeous writers, overwrought. I mean, it's wonderful to talk about the Judy Rogers and the Gabrielle Hamiltons, whose writing is spectacularly beautiful. But we're not all going to get there necessarily, but there's also room for all sorts of...
Yeah, I was thinking Ernest Hemingway was a man of few words, and then everybody had to try to write like Ernest Hemingway. And then somebody broke away from that and started using a lot of words, and then everyone sort of wanted to follow that person. I mean, if you find your own voice, you don't have to worry about who you're trying to be because you're just yourself. And sometimes I think some of the best writing is when you don't even realize that you're reading something so quickly because it's so clear, it's so visual without a lot of extra words. And that's really hard. And I tell you, that's not the first draft. That comes, maybe draft 3, draft 4. But going back to what you're saying about headnotes, that I think is really important, is that headnotes are an opportunity for voice. And sometimes I think that's overlooked. But one thing that could be interesting for somebody struggling to figure out how to order their cookbook, well, if you thought of it as a narrative structure of a beginning, middle, and end, you might figure out where those chapters for poultry and chickpeas and, I don't know, tahini go. I don't know what kind of book that would be, but anyway, you could maybe figure out like how to organize your book through sort of this overall narrative structure, whether that's a how-to book about making dumplings and it starts from the simplest dumpling to the most complex. That's a story arc.
Definitely.
You can play around with that.
Oh, that's a beautiful idea. There's a cookbook out, and unfortunately the author died last year, Shally Schmidt, but she wrote 6 California Kitchens. And again, it's a local favorite out here, but it's got national appeal. And she was actually the original owner of the French Laundry restaurant. And then Thomas Keller bought it from her. And so she actually tells the story of her recipes through these 6 California, her parents' kitchen, then the first restaurant they opened in the Napa Valley, then the French Laundry, then her famous apple farm in Mendocino, where people used to go for cooking classes and whatnot. And then finally when just she and her husband were alone, and then finally when she was alone. And not only is there a narrative story arc through, but this is something I really want to think about. Each chapter runs the gamut from appetizers to dessert.
Wow, interesting. Oh, I can't wait to look at that book.
And she writes her recipe. She right up front says, I don't use the ingredient list first and the method afterwards. I write my recipes the way they were written in my professional kitchens, which is the instruction is on the left and the ingredients it goes with is on the right. And then it's the next step and those ingredients and the next step and those ingredients. And it actually really works. I mean, I'm going to teach from this book because I always tell everybody, everyone's used to an ingredient list and then you've got to have the method in the same order. Everything appears in the order it does in the ingredient list. And I've actually had pushback from an Italian student, my good friend now, Viola Butoni, who's coming out with a book next year. She's like, no, that's not how Italians think. She's a native Italian. She's like, no, that's not how we think. We think differently. Like we think about where we go, we get the food, right? Because they don't shop in supermarkets traditionally, right? They would go to the Salumeria and whatever, blah, blah, blah. So there's also the opportunity now, I think, to break some of the old rules, the happy robot voice, and the really tight strictures of how ingredient lists and methods are written. You still have to be perfectly clear so your reader doesn't get lost. And there's also an opportunity for voice in methods now in a way that I'm not there yet. I haven't been able to really do that yet, but I see it all the time. Like even using the first person in the method, sometimes it's parenthetical and they'll say, what I actually do at this point is blah, blah, blah. I mean, you'll see it. There really is voice in the method now. And maybe that's next level, but it's a great part of the evolution of cookbook writing, I think.
It's so interesting, and it's such an interesting time, and I'm really glad to hear that you're teaching from a book that breaks the rules, because we're seeing more and more playing around with the sort of conventional format. As to voice in method, I think that's something that I love and have fought hard to do in my books.
Right. Because we get pushback. When you try to do that, you get pushback from your editor or the copy editor. They say, if you want to do this, is this a certain style request that you want us to put forward for all your recipes? So just for people to know, there's always somebody out there who's going to look to make your recipes as consistent as possible. And that's not a bad thing. It just means something to keep aware of. If in one point you want to say this is how you want the pasta to be boiled, and another one you want it to be boiled differently, just have a reason that you want them different, and then you can win that argument a little bit easier.
I'm just thinking, we're talking about head notes a lot, and something I fall into a trap when I write my head notes is I often find myself describing the recipe procedure in the head note. I try to explain the recipe away. And I think it comes from being a teacher, where I'll start a class by saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to boil the water for the pasta. Then in this pan, we're going to, whereas if you read the recipe, it all becomes clear. But I find myself trying to describe the recipe before the recipe. And it's a place where I can cut a lot. It goes back to what you're saying, Tori. Trust the reader. Don't talk down to them. They'll figure it out. They've read the title. They've looked at the ingredient list. They know what's coming.
Yes. That is a habit people develop. And the other thing that people do, my students do it. So let's say it's, Moroccan meatballs with yogurt dipping sauce. These Moroccan meatballs with yogurt dipping sauce, do you know what I'm saying? Don't repeat the title.
Oh, that's such a good tip. Yeah, that's such an easy one to do.
Yeah, I mean, trust the reader to be able to read the title.
Trust the reader.
But the thing is that head notes are precious. And depending on the design of your cookbook, and, Tartine, I think the cookbook, I think they actually had a 30-page recipe and half of it was head noted. But for the most part, head notes run maybe 60 to 100 words. That is not a lot. So it's precious real estate. Again, I think the technique that can help people is write it exactly how you want to write it, like, as the instructional way. Then set it aside. And then come back and look at it and say, is this what I really want to say about this recipe? Mm-hmm. That second round, I mean, many people just don't have the time. Yep. So I have a question for both of you. Do you write your head notes at the time that you're, drafting your recipe? Or do you wait till the end of the book?
Sometimes I'll write out the recipe with just some bullet points for a head note to come back to later. I really dread leaving head notes to the end because I'll just drag my feet. And I'm not a procrastinator, but there's something about seeing a ton of head notes that I need to write that will put me into some sort of, spiral of panic. And then I can't write. And we know that writer's block doesn't exist. You just need to write something. And sometimes you're lucky that you're writing the recipe and the head note is just there. And you just write it as fast as possible and you're going to come back and fix it. Other times you don't really know what the story's going to be. Maybe there's a couple placeholder bullet points I'll put in, I'll write the recipe, and then I'll go back to it. But I try not to wait too long, because the longer you wait on a recipe you've developed, the harder it is to write anything interesting about it. At least that's how I've found it. Molly, what about you?
It's such a great question. And I agree with everything you've said, Kate. Say I have a book that's got 120 recipes in it. The idea of sitting down and writing 120 head notes is just brain-numbingly painful, but also
scary.
They're not going to be as good, because my experience of that recipe, my in the kitchen sensory connection to that recipe is so far in my memory, because I tested it and developed it months ago or even years ago in some of my books. But so I always try to get something down when I write up the recipe the first time. And like you say, it may change, it may not be, but I try to have something there, because coming and looking at it, it's just like having a blank page, having, a recipe title and then the procedure or the ingredients of the procedure, and no inclination of, what's my case for having this recipe in the book is just, and then I end up with a sameness of the head notes if I write them all too many at once and fall into too many happy robot voices. So, but it's interesting though, because going back to that storytelling, my book projects tend to spread over a long span of time. And if the head notes have been written at such disparate times, the voice can change in ways. And so if I want to have a storytelling element, but that's what comes in editing, is going back and taking those head notes and making them all kind of feel like they belong together in a chapter or in a section or in a book in itself. And just what it comes down to length alone. Sure, there are exceptions all over the place, but I feel like books, you get a sense of how long a head note will be for this particular author. And that's your comfort level as you, and if you go through and suddenly there's one that's 2 sentences and then there's one that's 3 pages, it's a little disconcerting. So one of the things when I go back and edit is I try to make sure that there's a balance in my head notes.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, as well as balance in your recipe.
Yeah.
I write my head notes as I always write it down, because actually I don't have that great a memory. But then I treat it as a, Annie Lamott shitty first draft.
Yeah.
And then I do one full suite. Now, it depends on, I don't write cookbooks the length that you do, Molly. So, but I think it's very, very good to just use a food metaphor here, is to kind of let it stew.
Absolutely.
Let it cook a little bit.
Yeah.
We should, with all writing, we should strive to write with all our senses. And it's so important in food writing, because we rely on smell and taste. And sometimes we leave aside, the sound or the feel. I mean, when you're, touching dough, we often talk about that. Okay. But still, a writer named Annie Dillard, who's a very famous writer and not a food writer, but she writes wonderful, evocative prose. She said that, oddly enough, the way to a person's emotions is actually through their senses. So, that taps really into cookbooks. And I'm not saying, again, we don't all have to be Annie Dillard or Ernest Hemingway or Judy Rogers, but try where you can to engage the senses that you might not normally think of. The sound. Judy Rogers famously, in one of her recipes for Swiss chard, she said, if it's really fresh, if you squeeze it, it'll scrunch. What a great word, anyway.
So what else do you recommend your students read to just get exposed to different types of voices, different types of writing, so they can make their recipes, their cookbook proposals shine a little bit more?
Who I teach, there is a writer from the early 70s named Verna Smart Grosvenor, and I really like her book, Vibration Cooking. She came up with that great, I cook by vibration, which, that's a total vibing sound from the 70s, but still it's so true. Intuitive cooking is cooking by vibration. And she wrote a very unfiltered, off the cuff, sometimes a little bit, outrageous cookbook in the 70s that I do assign from. Now, it may not be to everyone's taste, because some of the writing is a little controversial, but she also weaves the recipes right into the prose. So she'll be halfway through a paragraph, she'll start a recipe. Really interesting. As far as contemporary writers go, I love Michael Twitty. I think he has one of the most interesting, forthright, authoritative, yet very affectionate and warm voices. And I think he's a really important writer.
Very prolific on social media as well. So you could sort of get a sense of his writing and there as well. But I would agree, very warm and engaging and smart.
And I mean, there's so many, and I actually would love to hear your recommendations too, but I loved Michelle Zauner's Crying in H Mart. I think it's not a cookbook, it's a food memoir. It's not even a food memoir. It's actually just a memoir of her mother, but there's a lot of food in it, and she has a wonderful voice.
The descriptions of food in that book are just amazing.
Yeah, it'll make you cry.
Yeah.
She connects the emotion, because food is how she and her mother connected. Right. That's where the emotional resonance in the book happens, is mostly around food. I love Lagaya Michon, and she writes for the Times. And I also teach poetry in my class. I mean, I don't teach the poetry.
Really?
Well, I have them read poetry. Billy Collins famously has a great poem called Osso Buco. I also love Nikki Giovanni, and she's not a food writer, but she has a poem called I Wrote a Good Omelet. It's actually quite funny.
But you learn an economy of words from poetry, which
you do.
So often we're writing against space, and word choice is so important. I mean, down to like, am I going to include the article here or not? Because word count can be so important, and poetry could teach you so much about those choices. That's awesome.
And the senses, of course. It's really, really all about the senses. And I love humor in food writing, and I think that's actually one of the hardest things to do. I try in my own way to be a touch funny, and that's also a confidence thing. Like, it's really hard to be funny on the page in anything, but it's interesting. I do think humor in food can actually be really effective. Who do you guys like to read?
I'm actually reading Nora Ephron's Heartburn on your recommendation, Tori, and just the way that she talks about her mother through what her mother was cooking for people. It's just, you get the sense of her mother completely, but you also just are laughing because it's so ridiculous. But the words she uses to describe food, you just don't see that often. So I'd say that, and economy of words. There's not a lot of words.
We're talking mostly about food writing here, or just good writing. But Kate, I think about the work you do as a wine writer, and that to me is just a next level challenge, because I think
there's so many grapes, and there's only so many ways you can describe the pink, the ruby, the cranberry flavors that pop in your mouth. I don't know. Some days are rough, I'll tell you.
Plus, it's full of cliches, right? Or, well, not cliches as much as overused language. I mean,
overused language, which is something
really a challenge.
One trick that any writer who's facing overused language can do is, if you have everything in a Word doc or you're using Scrivener, just do a word search for a word that you know that you use too much, and it'll just bring up all those words, and then you can see which ones you save and which ones you delete or you change to another word.
I've done that, and I just found my list right here. That's so funny. It's sitting here right next to my create is one. Start by, a bit. I say a bit a ton. I also use M dashes way too much. The key to this recipe. I would say the key. And consider. It's just, those are just funny words, and there's nothing wrong with any of those. But if they pop up in every single head note,
I tell my students, the average cookbook has let's say 80 recipes. The words that they use too often is always just, all. These are just space fillers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So those are really good things to cut out too. I love it that you keep a list, Molly. Wow.
The other thing I have up on my monitor is a Post-it that says, "Really?" ?
Yeah.
Because I am asking myself, really? Do you really mean that? Are you making shit up now? Excuse me, but are you making this up? Are you just telling a story because you don't have anything to say about this recipe? Or is there some truth into what you're saying? Because if there's no truth in what I'm saying, then why am I saying it?
Right. That's a good point. Before we had Tori on the podcast, we talked about the exercise of describing your work in 3 words. And this was something that is in Diane Jacobs' book, Will Write for Food. This is one of the exercises that she proposes that people do to try to get to know your voice or find your voice. Does everyone have their 3 words?
It was really hard.
So what's the answer, Molly?
I'm just going to go with clear, vivid, and encouraging.
I think you hit it. Yeah, that sounds exactly like how I would describe you.
Fantastic. You need to put that posted up on your wall too.
As opposed to all the things I shouldn't do, I should put up some things that I should.
Yeah,
That's true. That's very true.
Right.
And you, Kate?
All right. Specific, researched, and easy listening.
Oh, wow. And now that you two have worked so hard on summing it up in 3 words, I'll tell you that it actually, Diane says, like, 4 to 5 words.
Oh no! So we didn't even do the exercise, right?
No. Economy is good. So I encourage my students to try to describe what they think their voices are in 3 or 4 adjectives. And for myself, and this is specifically in my newsletter, because I still can't get the happy robot voice out of my head for cookbooks after all this. But I do try to write. I would say I'm friendly, I'm helpful, and I'm a little bit funny. I hope. That's what I strive for.
Yeah.
So these, like Molly, that's what you strive for.
Yeah.
And you're not always there, but it's a good exercise. And I'm telling you, it's hard. And writing cookbooks is hard. And sustaining voice over any long, whether it's a memoir or a cookbook or a novel or whatever, is hard. It's a little bit easier in the spontaneity and the unfilteredness of social media. And that's why that's such good practice.
I couldn't have summed up it better. So Tori, thank you so much. It's been a treat talking to you. I feel like Molly and I went to had a class
I know.
today.
I'm actually excited. We talk about how hard it is, Tori, but it also makes me want to keep doing it. Thank you so much for sharing.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I love it. Keep it going forever.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. You can find us on Instagram at Everything Cookbooks and join the email list on our website, everythingcookbooks.com. Thanks as always to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. If you have a minute, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. This does help more people find the show. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for joining, and we'll catch you next time. Until then, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.